Detective Sarah Martinez had seen it all in her 15 years of airport security work. Drug smugglers hiding cocaine and baby formula, identity thieves with perfect fake passports, and wealthy passengers thinking money could buy their way out of any situation. But nothing had prepared her for the moment when a routine bag check on Flight 447 would unravel a decades-old mystery that connected a glamorous actress, a missing fortune, and a family secret that powerful people would kill to keep buried. What started as a simple security violation would become the most dangerous case of her career, forcing Sarah to question everything she thought she knew about justice, family loyalty, and the price of truth. Sometimes the most innocent-looking passengers carry the darkest secrets, and sometimes those secrets refuse to stay hidden forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across Terminal 3 as Detective Sarah Martinez adjusted her radio and began her routine patrol. Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with its usual chaos of rushing travelers, crying babies, and the constant hum of announcements echoing through the vast halls. Sarah had worked airport security for 15 years, and she prided herself on reading people. Today felt different, though, charged with an energy she couldn't quite place. At exactly 9:47 a.m., Sarah's attention was drawn to a commotion near Gate 18. A tall woman with auburn hair and designer sunglasses was arguing with TSA agent Rodriguez about her carry-on bag. The woman moved with the graceful confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way, her voice carrying the slight accent that suggested expensive private schools and international upbringing. "I'm telling you, there must be some mistake," the woman insisted, her manicured hands gesturing elegantly. "I packed that bag myself this morning." Sarah approached, her trained eye immediately cataloging details. The woman wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary, perfectly pressed despite the early morning flight. Her luggage was high-end leather, the kind that aged beautifully and cost a fortune. Everything about her screamed wealth and status, but something in her eyes suggested desperation masked by practiced composure. "What seems to be the problem here?" Sarah asked, stepping into the conversation with the calm authority that came from years of handling difficult situations. Agent Rodriguez looked relieved to see backup. "Detective Martinez, we found something unusual during the random bag check. Ms. Victoria Sterling here claims she has no knowledge of how it got there." Victoria Sterling. Sarah filed the name away in her memory, noting how the woman's jaw tightened slightly when her full name was spoken aloud. There was recognition there, fear perhaps, but it was quickly covered by another flash of that practiced smile. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," Victoria said, her voice steady but her hands betraying her nerves as they fidgeted with her pearl necklace. "I'm an actress, you see. I'm flying to New York for a very important audition. Broadway producers don't wait, detective." Sarah had heard every excuse in the book, but something about Victoria's story rang true even as other details felt carefully constructed. She was definitely beautiful enough to be an actress, with the kind of bone structure that photographed well, and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. But there was something else, a quality that suggested she was more accustomed to being behind the scenes and in the spotlight. "Show me what you found," Sarah requested, and Rodriguez led them to a private screening room where Victoria's expensive leather bag sat open on the examination table. Inside, nestled between silk scarves and designer cosmetics, was a small wooden box that looked completely out of place among the luxury items. The box was old, made of dark mahogany, with intricate carvings that suggested it was handmade by someone with considerable skill. It was about the size of a jewelry box, but felt heavier than it should have, and when Sarah picked it up, she could hear something shifting inside. "I've never seen that before in my life," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. Her eyes were fixed on the box with an intensity that suggested deep familiarity, and Sarah noticed the way her breathing had become shallow. Sarah examined the box more carefully. The carvings weren't just decorative. They formed a pattern that looked almost like a map or diagram. Along one edge, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were initials carved in a delicate script. Yes to VS, forever in your heart, forever in your soul. Yes to VS, Sarah read aloud. And Victoria's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. That could be anyone, Victoria whispered, but her hand unconsciously moved to her throat where a thin gold chain disappeared beneath her blouse. Mind if I open it? Sarah asked, though it wasn't really a question. Victoria shook her head quickly, too quickly, and Sarah noticed the way her eyes darted toward the door as if calculating her chances of making a run for it. The box opened with a soft click, revealing contents that made both Sarah and Rodriguez gasp. Inside was a collection of items that told a story spanning decades. Old photographs, letters tied with faded ribbon, a small key that looked like it might belong to a safety deposit box, and, most intriguingly, a USB drive that looked distinctly modern compared to everything else. The photographs were what caught Sarah's attention first. They showed a young woman who looked remarkably like Victoria, standing next to various people in what appeared to be family gatherings from the 1980s and 1990s. One photo in particular made Sarah look twice. It showed the young woman standing next to a man in an expensive suit outside what looked like a courthouse, both of them smiling broadly, as if celebrating some kind of victory. This woman in the photos, Sarah said, holding up the image. She looks just like you. Victoria's composure finally cracked, and tears began to form in her eyes. That's my mother, she whispered. Elena Sterling. She died when I was 16. The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind. It's Elena Sterling. The box had belonged to Victoria's mother and had been passed down to her. But why would Victoria lie about recognizing it? And why did she seem so terrified of anyone finding it? Sarah picked up one of the letters, noting the expensive letterhead and the formal language. It appeared to be from a law firm, dated nearly 25 years ago, and mentioned something about final settlement and sealed records. The letter was addressed to Elena Sterling at an address in Beverly Hills, confirming receipt of documents and stating that all parties agree to the terms as discussed. Ms. Sterling, Sarah said gently, I think we need to have a longer conversation about this box and why you're so afraid of it. Victoria looked around the small room like a trapped animal. Her perfect composure had completely dissolved, replaced by raw fear and something that looked like grief. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. There are people who would do anything to get their hands on what's in that box. My mother spent her whole life running from them, and now they're after me too. Who's after you? Sarah asked, but Victoria was already shaking her head. I can't tell you. Not here, not now. They have people everywhere, people you wouldn't suspect. My mother thought she was safe too, right up until the end. Sarah's instincts told her that Victoria was telling the truth, or at least her version of it. The fear in her eyes was genuine, and the way she spoke about her mother suggested a pain that went much deeper than simple grief. This wasn't just about a missed flight anymore. This was about something much bigger and much more dangerous. The USB drive caught Sarah's attention again. It was small and black, the kind used for transferring large amounts of data. In her experience, when people went to great lengths to hide digital information, it was usually because that information was worth a lot of money or could put someone in serious trouble. What's on the drive? Sarah asked. Victoria looked at it as if seeing it for the first time, though Sarah was certain she knew exactly what it contained. I don't know, she lied. My mother left all of this to me, but I never went through it. I was too scared to find out what secrets she'd been keeping. Sarah had interrogated enough suspects to know when someone was holding back crucial information, but she also recognized genuine terror when she saw it. Victoria Sterling was caught between her fear of what was in that box and her fear of the people who wanted it. Look, Sarah said, making a decision that went against protocol but felt right in her gut. Why don't we continue this conversation somewhere more private? There are too many eyes and ears here, and if what you're saying is true about people watching you, we need to be more careful. Victoria nodded gratefully, and Sarah saw a flicker of hope in her eyes for the first time since the conversation began. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're the first person who's actually listened to me in months." As they prepared to leave the screening room, Sarah caught sight of a man in an expensive suit standing near the gate, pretending to read a newspaper, but clearly watching their every move. When he noticed Sarah looking at him, he quickly turned away, but not before she caught sight of his face. He was older, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from spending time on expensive yachts rather than working outdoors. "Do you recognize him?" Sarah asked quietly, nodding toward the man. Victoria followed her gaze, and her face went completely white. "Oh God," she breathed. "He found me. I thought I'd lost them in Denver, but they followed me anyway." The man was now walking purposefully toward them, his newspaper forgotten. Sarah could see the bulge of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket, and her hand instinctively moved to her own weapon. "We need to go," Sarah said urgently. "Now." As they hurried toward the exit, Sarah's mind was racing with questions. What was in that box that was worth following someone across the country for? Who was Elena Sterling, and what had she been running from? And, most importantly, what had Victoria gotten herself, and now Sarah, into? The answers would have to wait because right now, their priority was getting out of the airport alive. Behind them, Sarah could hear the sound of hurried footsteps, and she knew their pursuer wasn't alone. Whatever secrets were hidden in Elena Sterling's wooden box, someone was willing to kill to get them back. As they reached Sarah's car in the parking garage, Victoria turned to her with tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I never meant to drag anyone else into this nightmare. My mother died protecting these secrets, and now I've put your life in danger too." Sarah started the engine, her mind already formulating a plan. "Don't apologize yet," she said grimly. "We're going to figure this out together. But first, you need to tell me everything you know about what your mother was involved in and why someone would kill for that information." As they drove away from LAX, Sarah caught sight of two black SUVs pulling out behind them, maintaining a careful distance but clearly following. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than she'd initially realized. Whatever Elena Sterling had discovered all those years ago, it was valuable enough that powerful people would stop at nothing to keep it buried. The wooden box sat between them on the passenger seat, innocent-looking but containing secrets that could apparently get them both killed. Sarah had thought this would be just another routine day at the airport, but instead, she'd stumbled into a mystery that reached back decades and involved people with the resources and motivation to make problems disappear permanently. Looking in her rearview mirror at their pursuers, Sarah realized that her quiet life as an airport security detective was over. Now, she was part of something much bigger and much more dangerous than she'd ever imagined, and the only way out was through the truth that Elena Sterling had died protecting. Sarah drove through the maze of Los Angeles traffic, constantly checking her mirrors while Victoria sat in tense silence, clutching the wooden box like a lifeline. The two black SUVs maintained their pursuit with professional precision, never getting too close, but never falling far enough behind to lose sight of them. Sarah's mind raced through options, her 15 years of law enforcement training kicking into overdrive. "We can't go to the police station," Sarah said, taking a sudden right turn that earned angry honks from other drivers. "If these people have the resources you claim they do, they'll have contacts there. We need somewhere safe where we can examine what's in that box properly." Victoria looked up from her protective grip on the box, her eyes red from crying, but showing a flicker of the determination that had probably helped her survive this long. "There's a place," she said quietly. "My mother had a storage unit that nobody knew about. She made me memorize the address when I was a teenager, made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I would go there and destroy everything inside. But you never did," Sarah observed. "I was too scared. After she died, I just wanted to forget about all the fear and paranoia that had dominated my childhood. I wanted a normal life." Victoria laughed bitterly. "I guess I should have listened to her." Sarah made another series of quick turns, using her knowledge of LA's backstreets to try to lose their tail. The SUVs stayed with them, confirming her suspicion that these weren't amateur pursuers. What did your mother tell you about why she was running? You must have asked questions growing up. Victoria was quiet for so long that Sarah thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She told me that she used to work for very powerful people who made their money in ways that weren't always legal. She said she learned things about them that they couldn't allow to become public, and that's why we had to keep moving, keep changing our names. Sterling isn't your real last name? God, no. We've been Sterling for about 10 years now. Before that, we were the Morgans, and before that, the Grants. My mother was very good at creating new identities for us. She had connections, people who owed her favors from her old life. Sarah filed this information away, recognizing the pattern of someone deep in witness protection or running from organized crime. What kind of work did she do for these powerful people? Victoria hugged the box tighter. She was an accountant. She managed money for people who had a lot of it and needed it moved around quietly. She always said she was too smart for her own good, that she couldn't help but notice patterns in the numbers that told stories her employers didn't want told. An accountant who discovered financial crimes. That would explain the professional level of pursuit they were facing and why the secrets had remained dangerous for so many years. Financial crimes at that level rarely had statutes of limitations, and the people involved would have built entire empires on the foundation of those early illegal activities. Sarah spotted a parking structure that offered multiple exit routes and pulled in, taking the ticket and winding up several levels before finding a spot that couldn't be observed from the entrance. The SUVs hadn't followed them in, but Sarah knew they were probably positioning themselves to watch the exits. Okay, she said, turning to face Victoria fully. We have a few minutes before they figure out where we went. I need you to tell me everything you remember about what your mother said, every detail that seemed unimportant at the time. And then we're going to look at what's actually in this box. Victoria nodded, taking a shaky breath. She used to have nightmares. I'd hear her talking in her sleep about numbers that didn't add up, about money that disappeared from one account and reappeared in others. She'd mention names sometimes, Blackwood, Morrison, Chun. She said they had a network of businesses that looked legitimate on the surface, but were really just ways to clean dirty money. Money laundering, Sarah confirmed. Go on. The nightmares got worse toward the end. She started talking about something called the Foundation. She said it was their biggest operation, that they were taking money from people who trusted them and using it to fund things that would destroy lives. She became obsessed with stopping them, said she had proof of everything they'd done. Victoria opened the wooden box with trembling hands, revealing its contents in the dim light of the parking garage. Sarah pulled out her phone's flashlight to get a better look at the documents and photographs. The letters were more revealing than Sarah had initially realized. Several were from different law firms, all dated within a few months of each other 25 years ago. They referenced settlement agreements and non-disclosure clauses and mentioned payments totaling several $1 million. One letter in particular caught Sarah's attention. It was from a firm representing something called the Morrison Foundation and acknowledged receipt of certain financial documents in exchange for final payment and permanent silence. Your mother was paid to disappear, Sarah realized. These people didn't just scare her into running. They bought her silence. Victoria looked confused. But if she took their money and agreed to stay quiet, why did they keep chasing us? Why did she spend her whole life looking over her shoulder? Sarah was studying the photographs more carefully now, comparing them to the dates on the letters. In one image, Elena Sterling stood next to an older man outside what looked like a bank building. The man was well-dressed and confident, his arm around Elena in a gesture that suggested they were more than just business associates. But Elena's smile looked forced, and there was tension in her posture that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable. Maybe she kept copies of everything, Sarah suggested. The settlement might have required her to turn over all evidence, but what if she held back some insurance? The fact that this box exists suggests she didn't trust them to honor their agreement. The USB drive was the key, Sarah was certain of it. Everything else in the box, the photos, the letters, even the small key, they were probably just context for whatever digital evidence Elena had preserved. But they needed a computer to access it, and they needed somewhere safe to do it. That storage unit you mentioned, Sarah said. How far is it from here? About 20 minutes, but Victoria trailed off, looking uncertain. But what? My mother made me promise to destroy everything there if I ever went. She said it was too dangerous to let any of it survive. What if opening that USB drive makes things worse? What if there are people she cared about who could be hurt if this information comes out? Sarah understood the dilemma, but they were past the point of being able to walk away safely. Victoria, those people following us aren't going to just give up and go home if we hand over the box. If they've been chasing your family for 25 years, it means they believe you're still a threat to them. The only way we're going to survive this is if we find out exactly what they're so afraid of and figure out how to use it to protect ourselves. Victoria nodded reluctantly, giving Sarah directions to the storage facility. As they prepared to leave their hiding spot, Sarah noticed movement near the parking structure entrance. Two men in dark suits were talking to the attendant, probably showing him photos and asking questions. "We need to go out the back way," Sarah said, starting the engine and heading for the opposite exit. The storage facility was in a rundown part of town, the kind of place where people kept belongings they didn't want anyone to find. Victoria led Sarah through a maze of identical buildings to Unit 247, using a key she pulled from beneath her blouse, the same chain Sarah had noticed at the airport. Inside the storage unit, Sarah's flashlight beam revealed a space that looked like a command center for someone fighting a private war. The walls were covered with photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes connected by colored string like something from a conspiracy theorist's basement. But as Sarah looked more closely, she realized this wasn't paranoid delusion. It was a carefully constructed investigation that had taken Elena sterling years to compile. The center of one wall was dominated by an organizational chart showing connections between dozens of businesses, foundations, and political figures. At the top of the chart was a name Sarah recognized from Victoria's earlier description: Morrison Foundation Primary Operations Coordinator, James Blackwood. "My God," Victoria breathed, seeing the full scope of her mother's investigation for the first time. She never stopped working on this. Even after she took their money and promised to disappear, she kept collecting evidence. Sarah was studying the financial documents spread across a folding table. Elena Sterling had been meticulous in her record-keeping, creating detailed spreadsheets that tracked money flows between various entities. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars moved through shell companies and offshore accounts, all designed to obscure the original sources and destinations of the funds. But it was the destination that made Sarah's blood run cold. According to Elena's research, the Morrison Foundation wasn't just laundering money. They were using it to fund activities that included political manipulation, industrial espionage, and what appeared to be a network of private military contractors operating in conflict zones around the world. "This isn't just white-collar crime," Sarah said grimly. "If your mother's research is accurate, these people are responsible for destabilizing governments and profiting from human misery on a global scale." Victoria had found a laptop computer hidden beneath a pile of documents. "She must have kept backups of everything here," she said, powering it on. "Maybe we can finally see what's on that USB drive." As the computer booted up, Sarah continued examining the physical evidence. One folder contained what appeared to be personal correspondence between Elena and someone signing their letters only as them. The letters were clearly from someone with inside knowledge of the Morrison Foundation's operations, someone who had been helping Elena gather intelligence over the years. The most recent letter was dated just 6 months before Elena's death. In it, M warned that James Blackwood was becoming suspicious and that Elena needed to be more careful. The letter ended with an ominous line: "They're asking questions about you again. I don't think our agreement is going to protect you much longer. You need to disappear, really disappear this time." "Victoria," Sarah said urgently, "when exactly did your mother die? and how. Victoria looked up from the laptop, her face pale in the glow of the screen. 2 years ago, car accident on a rainy night. The police said she lost control on a curve, but she paused, clearly remembering something. But she was the most careful driver I knew. She never took risks, never drove in bad weather if she could avoid it. It wasn't an accident, Sarah said with certainty. They killed her because she was getting too close to exposing them, or because they found out about the storage unit and all the evidence she'd compiled. The laptop had finished booting, and Victoria inserted the USB drive with shaking hands. The drive contained dozens of folders with names like Blackwood Personal, Foundation Finances, and Political Connections. But one folder caught Sarah's attention immediately: Insurance Policy. Open that one, Sarah instructed. The insurance policy folder contained a video file dated just 1 week before Elena's death. Victoria double-clicked on it, and Elena Sterling's face appeared on the screen, looking exhausted and frightened but determined. "If you're watching this," Elena's recorded voice said, "then something has happened to me, and Victoria has finally found this storage unit. Honey, I'm so sorry you're seeing this. I try to protect you from all of this, but I always knew that someday you might need to know the truth." Victoria was crying again, seeing her mother's face for the first time since the funeral. Sarah put a comforting hand on her shoulder, but kept her attention focused on the screen. Elena continued, "The Morrison Foundation is not what it appears to be. James Blackwood and his partners have been using it as a front for money laundering, arms dealing, and worse things than I can bring myself to say out loud. I have evidence of all of it: bank records, recorded conversations, photographs of meetings that were supposed to be secret. I've spent the last 20 years of my life gathering this evidence, not for revenge, but because someone needs to stop them before they hurt more innocent people." The video went on to detail specific crimes, naming names and providing dates and locations. Elena had recordings of phone conversations between Blackwood and various political figures, photographs of weapon shipments, and financial records showing how foundation money had been used to fund military coups in 3 different countries. "The man I trusted, the man I thought I loved," Elena said, her voice breaking, "has blood on his hands from conflicts around the world. And I helped him hide the money that paid for it all. I can never forgive myself for that, but maybe I can prevent it from happening again." As the video ended, Sarah realized they were sitting on evidence that could bring down not just the Morrison Foundation, but an entire network of powerful people who had been operating above the law for decades. It was also evidence that would get them both killed if the wrong people found out they had it. "We need to get this to the authorities," Sarah said. But even as she spoke, she remembered Victoria's warning about not knowing who to trust. If Blackwood had been operating for 25 years without being caught, he certainly had people in law enforcement on his payroll. Victoria was staring at her mother's frozen image on the laptop screen. "She was so brave," she whispered. "All those years, I thought she was just paranoid and scared. But she was actually fighting them, still trying to stop them even after they paid her to disappear." A sound from outside the storage unit made them both freeze. Footsteps, trying to move quietly across the gravel parking area. Sarah quickly closed the laptop and stuffed the USB drive back into the wooden box. "Is there another way out of here?" she whispered. Victoria shook her head, looking trapped. The storage unit had only one entrance, and the footsteps were getting closer. Sarah could hear at least 2 people, possibly more, spreading out to surround the building. Sarah drew her weapon and positioned herself beside the door, gesturing for Victoria to get behind a stack of boxes. The footsteps had stopped, which was somehow more terrifying than hearing them approach. Whoever was out there was taking time to plan their attack, which suggested they were professionals. A voice called out from just outside the unit. "Ms. Sterling, we know you're in there. We also know you have something that belongs to us. Nobody needs to get hurt today. Just come out and bring the box with you." The voice was cultured and confident, with the slight accent of someone who had attended expensive schools. Sarah was willing to bet it belonged to James Blackwood himself. "We're not going anywhere," Sarah called back, not wanting to give away her exact position. "This is Detective Martinez, LAPD. You're trespassing on private property, and I suggest you leave immediately." There was silence for a moment, then the sound of quiet laughter. "Detective Martinez, I'm sorry you got caught up in this unfortunate situation, but I'm afraid you don't understand what you're dealing with. MS. Sterling's mother stole property that belongs to the Morrison Foundation, and we're simply here to retrieve it. Property that incriminates you in multiple felonies," Sarah shot back, "including murder." "Elena Sterling died in a tragic accident," the voice replied, though Sarah could hear the threat underneath the polite words. "Traffic fatalities are unfortunately common on California highways. It would be such a shame if there were more accidents involving people who stick their noses where they don't belong." Sarah knew they were running out of time. These people hadn't followed them across the city just to have a conversation. They were here to eliminate the threat that Victoria and the evidence represented, and they weren't going to leave empty-handed. Looking around the storage unit, Sarah spotted something that might help. Elena Sterling's investigation had apparently included surveillance equipment, and there was a small security camera mounted in the corner. If it was still recording, everything that happened here would be captured, providing evidence of Blackwood's crimes, even if neither she nor Victoria survived the encounter. The sound of metal on metal told Sarah that someone was working on the lock of the storage unit door. They had maybe 30 seconds before their hiding place was compromised. Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation, but felt like the right thing to do. She pulled out her phone and quickly started a video recording, propping it up behind a box where it wouldn't be easily seen. If this was going to be her last case, she was going to make sure there was evidence of what really happened. The door to the storage unit rolled up with a grinding sound, and James Blackwood stepped inside, flanked by two men in expensive suits. Blackwood was exactly what Sarah had expected, silver-haired, distinguished, and radiating the kind of confidence that came from never facing real consequences for his actions. His companions were younger and moved with the fluid precision of professional killers. "Detective Martinez," Blackwood said pleasantly, as if they were meeting at a social gathering, "and the lovely Victoria Sterling. You've led us quite a chase, but I'm afraid it ends here." James Blackwood stepped fully into the storage unit, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor as his eyes swept over Elena Sterling's elaborate investigation wall. His expression shifted from confident satisfaction to something much darker as he took in the full scope of what Elena had compiled over the years. My, he said softly, his cultured voice carrying a hint of admiration mixed with fury. "Elena was even more thorough than I gave her credit for. Look at this, gentlemen. 20 years of meticulous detective work, all designed to destroy everything we've built." Sarah kept her weapon trained on Blackwood while trying to keep track of his two companions, hood spread out to flank them. Both men had their hands inside their jackets, ready to draw weapons at a moment's notice. The situation was rapidly deteriorating, and Sarah knew that any sudden movement could turn the cramped storage unit into a killing ground. Victoria stepped out from behind the boxes, clutching the wooden box against her chest like a shield. Her fear was obvious, but there was something else in her expression now, a steely determination that reminded Sarah of the woman in Elena's video recording. "You killed my mother," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "She tried to disappear like you wanted, tried to live quietly with the money you paid her. But you couldn't leave her alone, could you?" Blackwood's smile was cold and predatory. "Your mother broke our agreement, Victoria. She was supposed to destroy all evidence of her time with the Foundation, but instead she spent 20 years building this." He gestured at the wall of documents and photographs, this shrine to her own guilt and paranoia. "It's not paranoia when people really are trying to kill you," Sarah interjected. "And from what I've seen in these documents, Elena had every reason to be afraid." "Detective Martinez," Blackwood said, turning his attention to Sarah with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to manipulating law enforcement officials, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. The Morrison Foundation is a legitimate charitable organization that has donated millions of dollars to worthy causes around the world. Elena Sterling was a disturbed woman who suffered from mental illness after her involvement in some unfortunate financial irregularities years ago. Sarah had heard enough lies from criminals to recognize the sophisticated version when she heard it. Blackwood was clearly intelligent and well-connected, the kind of man who could make problems disappear with a phone call to the right people. But he was also standing in a room full of evidence that contradicted every word he was saying. Mental illness, Sarah repeated. Is that what you call it when someone discovers that their employer is using charity money to fund arms deals and political assassinations? Blackwood's pleasant expression flickered for just a moment, revealing the ruthless calculation underneath. I see you've been reading Elena's fantasy novels, he said dismissively. The poor woman had quite an imagination. One of Blackwood's companions, a lean man with scarred hands that suggested a violent past, was growing impatient with the conversation. Sir, he said quietly, we should finish this quickly. The longer we stay here, the more chance someone notices we're here. But Victoria wasn't finished. I know what you did, she said, her voice growing stronger. My mother recorded everything. She has video of you talking about the weapons shipments to Syria, audio recordings of you planning to eliminate witnesses, financial records showing exactly how you moved money through fake charities to fund private armies. Blackwood's mask of civility finally slipped completely. Your mother was a foolish woman who never understood the bigger picture, he snarled. Do you think the world runs on good intentions and moral principles? The work we do requires resources and flexibility that official channels can't provide. Sometimes peace has to be bought with blood, and someone has to be willing to make the hard choices. Hard choices, Sarah said incredulously. You mean like murdering an accountant who threatened to expose your crimes? Elena Sterling died in a car accident, Blackwood replied, but his eyes were cold as winter. Though I admit it was convenient timing. She had become uncooperative in her old age. Sarah realized that Blackwood was essentially confessing to murder, probably because he had no intention of letting either her or Victoria leave the storage unit alive. The recording on her phone was capturing everything, but that would only matter if someone eventually found it. Victoria was studying Blackwood with intense curiosity, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. You were the one, she said suddenly. In the photographs, standing next to my mother outside that bank. You weren't just her employer, were you? You were lovers. Blackwood's expression softened slightly, showing genuine emotion for the first time since entering the storage unit. Elena was a remarkable woman, he admitted. Brilliant, beautiful, passionate about justice. I loved her in my way, but love doesn't excuse betrayal, and she betrayed everything we built together. She betrayed your criminal organization, Sarah corrected. That's called having a conscience. She betrayed me, Blackwood said firmly. After everything I gave her, everything we shared, she chose to destroy it all because she couldn't stomach the realities of how change actually happens in the world. She was naive, Detective Martinez, just like you are. Sarah was looking for an opportunity to improve their tactical position, but Blackwood's men were professionals who had clearly done this before. They maintained good spacing and kept their weapons ready without appearing overtly threatening. Any move she made would have to be perfect because she wouldn't get a second chance. Victoria suddenly stepped forward, holding out the wooden box toward Blackwood. Here, she said. Take it. Take everything. I don't want any part of this anymore. Victoria, no, Sarah started to say, but Victoria shot her a look that suggested this was part of a plan. Blackwood reached for the box eagerly, his eyes lighting up with the satisfaction of finally recovering the evidence that had threatened him for so many years. But as his fingers touched the wooden surface, Victoria's other hand came up holding a small device that Sarah recognized as a voice recorder. You just confessed to murdering my mother, Victoria said, her voice triumphant despite the danger they were still in. And it's all been recorded. Blackwood's face went white with rage, and he snatched the box from Victoria's hands while motioning for his men to take action. But Victoria's distraction had given Sarah the opening she needed. She dove behind a stack of boxes just as the first shots rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space. The storage unit erupted into chaos as Sarah returned fire, trying to provide cover for Victoria while keeping the three men pinned down. Blackwood had retreated toward the door, clutching Elena's wooden box like a prize, while his two companions advanced with practiced coordination. Victoria had taken shelter behind Elena's desk, and Sarah could see her frantically working with something, possibly Elena's laptop or another piece of recording equipment. Whatever she was doing, Sarah hoped it was worth the risk they were taking. "Give it up, detective," called the scarred man as he moved closer to Sarah's position. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Nobody has to die here if you just walk away." "Too late for that," Sarah called back, trying to keep track of both attackers while conserving her ammunition. "Your boss already admitted to murder on tape." The shooting paused as both sides repositioned themselves, and in the momentary quiet, Sarah could hear sirens in the distance. Someone had called the police, probably other storage unit customers who had heard the gunfire. The cavalry was coming, but Sarah wasn't sure they could hold out long enough for help to arrive. Blackwood was getting increasingly agitated as he realized that the situation was spiraling out of his control. "Finish this," he ordered his men. "Both women, quickly, and then we leave." The scarred man produced what looked like a grenade from his jacket pocket, and Sarah's blood ran cold. In the confined space of a storage unit, an explosive device would kill everyone inside, destroying the evidence along with the witnesses. "Stop!" Victoria called out suddenly, standing up from behind the desk with her hands raised. "Mr. Blackwood, I have something you need to see before you do anything irreversible." She was holding Elena's laptop, the screen facing toward Blackwood, so he could see what was displayed. Sarah couldn't see the screen from her position, but whatever Victoria was showing him had a dramatic effect. Blackwood's face went from rage to shock to something approaching panic. "That's not possible," he whispered. "Elena destroyed all copies of that material as part of our agreement." "She destroyed all the copies you knew about," Victoria replied. "But my mother was smarter than you gave her credit for. She uploaded everything to multiple cloud storage accounts, with instructions to automatically release the files to law enforcement and media contacts if she died under suspicious circumstances." Sarah could see the calculation happening in Blackwood's eyes as he weighed his options. If Victoria was telling the truth, then killing them would only accelerate the exposure of his crimes. But if she was bluffing, then eliminating the witnesses might still salvage the situation. The sirens were getting closer now, and Sarah could hear the sound of car doors slamming in the parking area outside. The police had arrived, which meant Blackwood's window of opportunity was rapidly closing. "You're lying," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. Elena wouldn't have done that. She knew what would happen to people she cared about if that information became public. Victoria's smile was sad, but determined. She also knew what would happen if people like you were allowed to continue operating without consequences. "My mother spent the last 20 years of her life trying to balance protecting the people she loved with stopping the people she feared. In the end, she chose justice." The sound of footsteps running toward the storage unit made everyone freeze. Police voices were calling for backup and reporting shots fired. Blackwood's men looked to him for guidance, their hands still on their weapons, but their confidence clearly shaken. Sarah took advantage of the distraction to improve her position, moving closer to Victoria while keeping her weapon trained on the nearest threat. "It's over, Blackwood," she called out. "You can surrender now, or you can explain to a dozen police officers why you're standing in a storage unit full of evidence with smoking guns in your hands." Blackwood looked around the storage unit one more time, his eyes lingering on Elena's investigation wall, with something that might have been respect mixed with regret. Then he made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. "Stand down," he ordered his men quietly. "Put your weapons away." The scar man looked confused. "Sir, we can still dash, we can still what?" Blackwood snapped. "Kill a police detective, and the daughter of the woman we're already suspected of murdering? In front of half the LAPD? Use your head, Marcus." As police voices got closer, Blackwood straightened his tie and smoothed his silver hair back into place, transforming himself back into the distinguished gentleman he appeared to be in public. "Detective Martinez," he said formally, "I believe you'll find that any alleged confessions made under duress in this chaotic situation will be inadmissible in court. And without proper chain of custody for any evidence you may have found here, your case will fall apart before it reaches trial." Sarah realized he was right. Everything they had discovered in the storage unit could be challenged by expensive lawyers, and Blackwood's apparent confession had been made under circumstances that any competent defense attorney could attack. The man had been playing this game for decades, and he knew exactly how the legal system worked. But Victoria stepped forward one more time, holding up her phone. "Maybe," she said, "but what about the live video stream I've been broadcasting to my social media accounts for the last 10 minutes? 40,000 people just watch you admit to murdering my mother, and the video is being shared faster than your lawyers can suppress it." Blackwood's face went gray as he realized what she had done. In the age of social media and viral videos, his carefully constructed reputation could be destroyed in hours, regardless of what happened in any eventual legal proceedings. The court of public opinion moved much faster than the justice system, and it was much harder to control. The first police officers burst into the storage unit just as Blackwood was reaching for Victoria's phone, probably intending to destroy it. "LAPD, everyone on the ground now." Sarah immediately identified herself and began explaining the situation while Blackwood and his men were disarmed and restrained. The storage unit filled with officers, paramedics, and eventually crime scene investigators who began the painstaking process of cataloging Elena Sterling's evidence. As Victoria was giving her statement to the responding officers, she caught Sarah's eye and smiled for the first time since their ordeal began. "My mother would be proud," she said softly. "She always said the truth has a way of coming out eventually." Sarah nodded, but she knew their fight was far from over. Blackwood was wealthy and well-connected, and he would have access to the best legal representation money could buy. Proving his crimes in court would be much harder than exposing them on social media, and there were probably other powerful people who would want to see this investigation buried. Still, as she watched the crime scene team carefully documenting Elena Sterling's 20 years of investigative work, Sarah felt a sense of hope. Sometimes justice moves slowly, but it did move. And sometimes ordinary people like Elena Sterling and her daughter Victoria were brave enough to stand up against forces much more powerful than themselves. The wooden box that had started this whole adventure was now evidence in a criminal case that would likely make headlines around the world. Inside that box, Elena Sterling had preserved not just proof of specific crimes, but evidence of a system of corruption that reached into the highest levels of business and government. As Sarah left the storage facility that evening, she realized that her quiet life as an airport security detective was definitely over. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe some cases were worth the risk, and some truths were worth fighting for, no matter how dangerous the fight might become. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the storage facility, Sarah Martinez found herself sitting in a sterile conference room at FBI headquarters in downtown Los Angeles, surrounded by federal agents, prosecutors, and enough paperwork to fill a small warehouse. The investigation into the Morrison Foundation had exploded into one of the largest financial crime cases in decades, with tentacles reaching into corporate boardrooms, political offices, and military contractor networks across 3 continents. Special Agent Jennifer Chun, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in international money laundering cases, spread a series of financial charts across the conference table. Thanks to Elena Sterling's documentation and the digital evidence we recovered from her storage unit, we've been able to trace the Morrison Foundation's operations back over 25 years, she explained. What we found is staggering. Sarah studied the charts, trying to comprehend the scope of what Elena had uncovered. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. Billions of dollars moved through shell companies, dummy corporations, and fake charitable foundations. But it wasn't just the money that was shocking. It was what the money had been used for. Arms sales to embargoed nations, funding for mercenary groups in African civil wars, bribes to government officials in South America. Agent Shin continued. The Morrison Foundation wasn't just laundering money. They were actively destabilizing governments and profiting from the chaos they created. Victoria Sterling sat across from Sarah, looking exhausted but determined. The past 3 weeks have been a whirlwind of interviews, depositions, and media attention that she was clearly struggling to handle. Death threats had forced her into protective custody, and the stress of constantly looking over her shoulder was taking its toll. How much of this can we actually prove in court? Sarah asked, knowing that the difference between having evidence and having admissible evidence could be enormous in a case this complex. Federal prosecutor Michael Roberts, a man who had built his career on taking down white-collar criminals, looked cautiously optimistic. More than Blackwood's lawyers think we can. Elena Sterling was meticulous about documentation, and she understood enough about legal standards to make sure her evidence would hold up under scrutiny. Plus, Victoria's video stream from the storage unit gave us Blackwood's confession in his own words. But Sarah could see the concern in Robert's expression, and she knew there had to be complications. Cases like this always had complications, especially when they involve people with the resources to fight back through the legal system and other means. There's something else, Agent Chun said, glancing around the room before continuing. We've discovered that James Blackwood wasn't the only high-profile figure involved in the Morrison Foundation's operations. We have evidence linking several current and former government officials, military contractors, and even some foreign intelligence services. She activated a laptop connected to a projector, and the room screen filled with an organizational chart that made Elena's investigation wall look simple by comparison. Names, dates, financial connections, and criminal activities were mapped out in intricate detail, showing a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of power. Some of these people are still in positions of significant authority, Agent Shun continued. They have the motivation and resources to make this investigation very difficult for all of us. We've already had pressure from several different directions to limit the scope of our inquiry. Sarah felt a chill as she recognized some of the names on chart. Politicians she had voted for, business leaders she had respected, military officials who had been celebrated as heroes. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined, and the people involved would fight desperately to keep their involvement hidden. Victoria was staring at the screen with horrified fascination. My mother knew about all of this, she said quietly. She lived with this knowledge for 20 years, knowing that she was the only person who could expose them, but also knowing that coming forward would probably get her killed. She was incredibly brave, Agent Chin acknowledged, and incredibly smart. The evidence she collected is the key to unraveling this entire network. Without her work, most of these crimes would never have come to light. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor at LAX. Need you back on duty, ASAP. Situation developing. She showed the message to Agent Shun, who frowned. We've had reports of unusual activity at several airports, the FBI agent explained. People associated with the Morrison Foundation's network have been trying to leave the country, probably anticipating that indictments are coming soon. Your expertise in airport security could be valuable in preventing key suspects from fleeing. Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Ray Morales, her partner from her days working regular police cases before transferring to airport security. Ray was now with the LAPD's organized crime unit, and Sarah hadn't heard from him in months. Sarah, thank God. Ray's voice was tense and urgent. We have a situation. 3 people connected to your Morrison Foundation case were found dead in a warehouse in San Pedro this morning. Professional hits, execution style. Someone is cleaning house. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Who were they? Marcus Webb. He was one of Blackwood's enforcers, the guy with the scars who was at the storage unit with you. Also a woman named Patricia Chun, who apparently handled financial transactions for the foundation, and a man named David Morrison, who we think was related to the original founder of the organization. Agent Shin was listening to Sarah's side of the conversation with growing alarm. "Put him on speaker," she requested. "Detective Morales, this is Special Agent Shun, FBI. Can you tell us anything about the circumstances of these murders?" Ray's voice came through the phone speaker, grim and professional. All three were killed within a few hours of each other at different locations around the city. Very clean, very professional. No witnesses, no physical evidence left behind. Whoever did this has serious resources and experience. "It's damage control," Victoria said, her face pale with fear. "They're eliminating anyone who might testify against the people at the top of the organization." Sarah realized that the investigation had entered a new and more dangerous phase. The people behind the Morrison Foundation were no longer trying to cover up their crimes quietly. They were actively eliminating threats, which meant that everyone involved in exposing them was now in mortal danger. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Prosecutor Roberts said, making rapid calculations. "If they're killing potential witnesses, we need to get indictments issued and key suspects arrested before they can flee the country or eliminate more evidence." Agent Chun was already on her radio, coordinating with other FBI teams around the city. "All units, this is Chun. We're moving to arrest protocol immediately. All surveillance teams maintain eyes on primary targets and report any movement immediately." Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from airport security. Detective Martinez, her supervisor's voice was strained. "We have a problem at Terminal 2. A private jet is preparing for immediate departure, and we have reason to believe James Blackwood is on board." "That's impossible," Sarah said. "He's supposed to be under house arrest with electronic monitoring. The monitoring bracelet was found cut off in his bathroom 20 minutes ago. He's been gone for at least 4 hours, maybe longer." Sarah looked around the conference room at the assembled law enforcement officials, seeing her own realization reflected in their faces. Blackwood wasn't just running. He had been planning this escape for weeks, possibly since the moment he was first arrested. And if he made out of the country, he would disappear into a network of safe houses and friendly governments that would make him virtually impossible to recapture. "I have to get to LAX, Sarah said, already heading for the door. "If Blackwood escapes, half of this case disappears with him." Victoria stood up as well. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Agent Shin said firmly. "You're in protective custody for a reason. If Blackwood's people are killing witnesses, you're at the top of their target list." But Victoria's expression was determined. "My mother spent 20 years hiding from these people, and it didn't keep her safe in the end. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. If there's a chance to stop Blackwood from escaping, I want to be there." Sarah understood Victoria's need to be involved, but she also knew how dangerous the situation had become. "If you come with me, you follow my lead completely. No heroics, no taking unnecessary risks." "Agree," Victoria nodded, and Agent Shin reluctantly agreed to provide them with backup support. As they prepared to leave for the airport, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Blackwood was too smart to simply run without a plan, and he had too many resources to be caught easily. The drive to LAX took 30 minutes through heavy traffic, and Sarah used the time to coordinate with airport security and review what they knew about Blackwood's escape. The private jet was registered to a shell company that traced back to one of the Morrison Foundation's subsidiary organizations. The flight plan showed a destination of Nassau, Bahamas, but Sarah knew that was probably just the first stop in a journey that could take Blackwood anywhere in the world. As they approached the airport, Sarah's radio crackled with updates from the field teams. Target vehicle spotted entering the airport complex. Black Mercedes sedan, license plate matches the Bolo alert. "All units, this is Martinez," Sarah responded. "Maintain surveillance, but do not approach until backup arrives. Suspect is considered extremely dangerous and may be armed." Victoria was checking her phone constantly, monitoring the social media response to the ongoing revelations about the Morrison Foundation. "The story is everywhere," she reported. "News networks, social media, international press. Even if Blackwood escapes, the whole world knows what he's done. Sarah appreciated Victoria's optimism, but she knew that public exposure wasn't the same as justice. Rich criminals who fled to countries without extradition treaties could live comfortably for decades, while their victims never saw any real consequences for the crimes committed against them. They reached the airport and made their way through security to the private aviation terminal where Blackwood's jet was supposedly preparing for departure. Sarah's radio was alive with chatter from various law enforcement teams converging on the location, and she could see FBI agents and local police officers taking positions around the terminal building. But as they approached the gate where the private jet was supposed to be, Sarah realized something was wrong. The tarmac was empty except for a few maintenance vehicles, and there was no sign of any aircraft preparing for immediate departure. "Control, this is Martinez," Sarah spoke into her radio. "I'm at the private terminal, and I don't see any jet. Are you sure about the location?" The response came back immediately. "Martinez, be advised that the target aircraft departed 15 minutes ago. Flight plan has been amended to show a destination of Mexico City." Sarah felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. They had been too late, and Blackwood was already in the air, heading for a country where the extradition process could take years, even if it was successful. But something about the situation still felt wrong to her, and her instincts were screaming that they were missing something important. Victoria had wandered over to the terminal's flight information display and was studying the departure information. "Sarah," she called out urgently, "come look at this." The display showed 3 private aircraft departures within the past hour, all heading to different international destinations. One to the Bahamas, one to Mexico City, and one to Switzerland. It was a shell game. Blackwood had arranged multiple flights to confuse law enforcement and make it impossible to know which aircraft he was actually on. "He could be on any of them," Victoria said, "or none of them. This is exactly the kind of misdirection my mother said he was famous for." Sarah was studying the flight information more carefully, looking for patterns or clues that might reveal which departure was real. The timing was too convenient, the destinations too obvious. Blackwood was smart enough to know that law enforcement would expect him to run to a non-extradition country, so maybe he had done the opposite. Her phone rang, and she saw Ray Morales' name on the caller ID. "Sarah, we just got a break in the murder investigation. One of the victims had a cell phone that the killer missed, and we recovered text messages that were sent right before he died." "What did they say?" "The victim was warning someone that the cleaners are coming and that everyone needed to stick to the Brussels protocol." "Does that mean anything to you?" "Brussels. Not the Bahamas, not Mexico City, not Switzerland." Sarah looked at the flight information display again, searching for any departures to Belgium or anywhere else in Europe that might fit the pattern. "There," Victoria pointed to a line on the display that showed a departure to London 20 minutes earlier. London would be the perfect jumping-off point to get to Brussels. And from Brussels, he could disappear anywhere in the European Union. Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent update. "All units, be advised that we have confirmation that the target was not on the aircraft to Mexico City." Repeat, Blackwood was not on the Mexico flight. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. While they had been focused on the obvious international destinations, Blackwood had taken a flight to London, probably using a false identity that would get him into the EU before anyone realized what had happened. "Control, this is Martinez. I need immediate contact with international law enforcement. Our suspect is likely en route to Brussels via London, and we need to coordinate with European authorities to intercept him before he disappears completely." As Sarah began the complex process of coordinating an international manhunt, she looked at Victoria and saw a mixture of determination and frustration in the young woman's eyes. They had come so close to stopping Blackwood, but in the end, his resources and connections had allowed him to stay one step ahead of justice. The investigation would continue, and other members of the Morrison Foundation network would be arrested and prosecuted. But the man at the center of it all, the person who had ordered Elena Sterling's death and countless other crimes, was now free and probably beyond the reach of American law enforcement. Sarah realized that this case had changed from a pursuit of justice to a much longer and more complex battle against a system of corruption that spanned multiple countries and decades of criminal activity. The fight was far from over, but the next phase would be fought on a much larger stage, with stakes that went far beyond any individual case or arrest. 6 months after James Blackwood's escape, Sarah Martinez stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C., sworn in as a witness in what the media had dubbed the Morrison Foundation hearings. The ornate chamber was packed with reporters, congressional staff, and families of victims from around the world who had traveled to see justice finally being served, even if incompletely. Victoria Sterling sat in the front row of the gallery, no longer the terrified woman Sarah had met at LAX, but transformed into a fierce advocate for the victims of the Foundation's crimes. She had established a nonprofit organization dedicated to tracking international money laundering operations and supporting whistleblowers who risked everything to expose corruption. The wooden box that had started their journey together was now part of the Smithsonian's collection, a symbol of one person's courage in the face of overwhelming power. Detective Martinez, Senator Patricia Walsh began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for government accountability. Please tell this committee how a routine airport security check uncovered what our intelligence services are now calling one of the largest criminal enterprises in modern history. Sarah had told this story dozens of times over the past months, to FBI investigators, federal prosecutors, international law enforcement agencies, and now to Congress. But each time she recounted the events, she was struck by how a single moment of curiosity and professional instinct had unraveled a conspiracy that had operated in shadows for decades. Senator, it began with a woman who was scared but determined to do the right thing, Sarah began, looking at Victoria as she spoke. Victoria Sterling could have thrown that box away, could have decided that her safety was more important than her mother's legacy. Instead, she chose to trust a stranger and fight for the truth. The investigation that had followed Elena Sterling's revelations had been unprecedented in its scope and complexity. 17 countries had opened parallel investigations into Morrison Foundation operations within their borders. Hundreds of bank accounts had been frozen, containing over $2 billion in laundered funds. Arrest warrants had been issued for 43 individuals in 12 different nations. But James Blackwood remained free. Despite an international manhunt involving Interpol, the FBI, and law enforcement agencies across Europe, Blackwood had vanished completely after his flight to London. Occasional sightings placed him in Switzerland, Monaco, or the Cayman Islands, but each lead turned out to be either false or arrived too late to be actionable. The man had clearly spent years preparing for this possibility, establishing safe houses and false identities that allowed him to disappear into the global network of wealthy criminals who live beyond the reach of justice. Detective Martinez, Senator James Richardson interrupted, his tone more skeptical than his colleagues. While the committee appreciates your service in this matter, isn't it true that the primary suspect in this case has escaped justice entirely? What good are these hearings if the person responsible for these crimes is living freely somewhere in the world? Sarah had expected this question, and she had thought carefully about how to answer it. Senator James Blackwood may be free for now, but his entire criminal enterprise has been destroyed. The Morrison Foundation has been dissolved, its assets seized, and its network of accomplices scattered. More importantly, the truth about their operations is now public knowledge. That matters. What Sarah didn't say, but what everyone in the room understood, was that Blackwood's freedom was temporary. Rich fugitives might be able to hide for years, but they couldn't hide forever. And in the modern world, where digital footprints and financial transactions left trails that could be followed by determined investigators, even the most sophisticated criminal eventually made mistakes. Agent Jennifer Chun, who had been promoted to head the FBI's new International Financial Crimes Division as a result of her work on the Morrison case, was the next witness called to testify. She brought with her charts and documents that told the story of how Elena Sterling's evidence had been used to trace criminal operations across 6 continents. The Morrison Foundation operated by identifying regions of political instability and then profiting from the chaos, Agent Chun explained to the committee. They would fund opposing sides in civil conflicts, sell weapons to both sides, and then position themselves to benefit from whatever government emerged victorious. It was war profiteering on an industrial scale. The human cost of these operations was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that Morrison Foundation activities had contributed to conflicts that resulted in over 50,000 civilian deaths and created more than 2 million refugees. The foundation had destabilized entire regions, corrupted democratic processes, and turned human suffering into quarterly profits. Victoria was called to testify in the afternoon session, and Sarah watched with pride as the young woman addressed the committee with eloquence and passion that would have made her mother proud. Victoria had become a powerful advocate for the victims of financial crimes, and her testimony was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "My mother, Elena Sterling, was not a saint," Victoria told the senators. She participated in money laundering operations for years before her conscience caught up with her. But when she realized what her work was contributing to, she spent the rest of her life trying to make amends. She could have taken the foundation's money and lived quietly, but she chose to fight back, even though she knew it would probably cost her life. Victoria's voice broke slightly as she continued. She died protecting information that has now prevented countless future crimes. Her sacrifice wasn't in vain, but it shouldn't have been necessary. If we had better systems for protecting whistleblowers, if we had taken financial crimes more seriously, if we had listened to people like my mother when they tried to speak out, maybe thousands of people would still be alive today. The committee's final day of hearings included testimony from victims of Morrison Foundation operations around the world. A farmer from Colombia, whose village had been destroyed in a conflict funded by Foundation money. A mother from Syria who had lost 3 children to weapons sold through Foundation networks. A former soldier from Democratic Republic of Congo who described how Foundation-funded mercenaries had committed atrocities that still haunted his dreams. Each story was a reminder that the crimes revealed by Elena Sterling's investigation weren't just financial abstractions. They were real acts of violence committed against real people whose only crime was living in places where powerful people could profit from their suffering. As the hearings concluded, Sarah found herself walking through the halls of the Capitol with Victoria, both of them processing the emotional weight of what they had heard over the past week. The legislative recommendations that would emerge from these hearings might prevent similar crimes in the future, but they couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. "Do you think it was worth it?" Victoria asked as they stood on the Capitol steps, looking out over the National Mall. "All the pain, all the fear, all the sacrifice, do you think we actually changed anything?" Sarah considered the question carefully. In purely practical terms, the Morrison Foundation investigation had been both a success and a failure. They had exposed massive crimes and disrupted a global criminal network, but the person most responsible for those crimes was still free. Justice had been served, but incompletely. "Your mother once recorded a video message where she said that someone needed to stop these people before they hurt more innocent people," Sarah replied. "We may not have caught Blackwood, but we stopped his organization. The foundation is gone. Their financial networks are destroyed, and their methods are now known to law enforcement agencies around the world. That will save lives." 3 months after the congressional hearings, Sarah received a phone call that she had been expecting for over a year. Agent Chin's voice was tense with excitement. "We found him. Blackwood made a mistake in Monaco, used a credit card that we'd been monitoring. Local police have him in custody, and extradition papers are already being processed." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction that was quickly followed by caution. Blackwood had eluded capture for so long that she had begun to wonder if he ever would face justice. Now that the moment had arrived, she found herself worried about all the ways that things could still go wrong. "How solid is the extradition?" she asked. "Monaco has been very cooperative throughout this investigation. They don't want to be seen as a safe haven for international criminals. Unless Blackwood's lawyers can find some procedural loophole, he should be back in the United States within 30 days. The trial, when it finally took place, was a media sensation that lasted 4 months and featured testimony from hundreds of witnesses from around the world. Sarah testified for 3 days, walking the jury through the chain of evidence that had led from a wooden box in an airport security screening to the exposure of a global criminal enterprise. Victoria testified as well, describing her mother's legacy and the price that whistleblowers paid for their courage. Her testimony was devastating in its emotional impact, and several jurors were seen wiping away tears as she described Elena Sterling's final video message. James Blackwood himself was a compelling witness in his own defense, articulate, and charming even when describing activities that had resulted in massive loss of life. He maintained that the Morrison Foundation's operations were misunderstood humanitarian efforts, and that the violence associated with their activities was an unfortunate but necessary byproduct of bringing stability to troubled regions. The jury didn't buy it. After deliberating for 8 hours, they returned guilty verdicts on all 47 counts, including racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and terrorism-related charges. Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, finally ending his decades-long career as one of the world's most sophisticated criminals. Standing outside the courthouse after the verdict was announced, Sarah found herself reflecting on the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a routine bag check at LAX, but it had become something much larger, a reminder that ordinary people could fight back against extraordinary corruption when they were brave enough to take risks for the truth. Victoria stood beside her, older and more serious than the frightened woman Sarah had first met, but with a strength that came from having faced her worst fears and survived. The wooden box that had contained Elena Sterling's secrets was now safely preserved as evidence, but its real legacy lived on in the lives that had been saved and the crimes that had been prevented. "What's next for you?" Sarah asked as they watched James Blackwood being led away in handcuffs for the last time. Victoria smiled, and for a moment Sarah could see Elena Sterling in her daughter's expression. "There are other boxes out there," she said. "Other people like my mother who gathered evidence, but were too scared to come forward. My organization is working to create safe channels for whistleblowers, better protection programs, and legal frameworks that make it easier to prosecute international financial crimes." Sarah nodded, understanding that this case had been just the beginning of a much larger fight. The Morrison Foundation was gone, but the systems that had allowed it to operate for decades were still largely intact. Changing those systems would require the kind of sustained effort that Elena Sterling had demonstrated, the willingness to fight for justice even when the personal cost was enormous. As they walked away from the courthouse, Sarah realized that her own life had been permanently changed by her encounter with Victoria Sterling and her mother's legacy. She had returned to her job at LAX, but she was no longer just an airport security detective. She was now part of a growing network of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and advocates who were dedicated to fighting international financial crimes and protecting the people brave enough to expose them. The wooden box that had started it all was now part of history, but its message lived on. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption is a single person willing to collect evidence, preserve the truth, and pass that truth on to someone else brave enough to act on it. Elena Sterling had died, believing that her sacrifices might someday make a difference. Looking at the newspaper headlines celebrating Blackwood's conviction and the legislative reforms that were already being implemented as a result of the congressional hearings, Sarah knew that Elena's faith had been justified. The truth had indeed come out, justice had eventually been served, and the world was a little bit safer because one woman had been brave enough to fight back against overwhelming odds. The investigation that had begun with a routine airport security check had become a landmark case in international law enforcement, proving that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations were vulnerable to determined investigators who were willing to follow the evidence wherever it led. Sarah had learned that justice might be delayed, but it was not denied, and sometimes the most important victories came not from catching every criminal, but from exposing every crime and ensuring that the truth could never again be hidden in shadows. As she drove home through the streets of Los Angeles, Sarah thought about all the other secrets that might be hidden in luggage passing through airports around the world, waiting for the right person to notice them and have the courage to act. The fight against corruption was never really finished, but thanks to people like Elena and Victoria Sterling, at least it was being fought by people who understood that some truths were worth any sacrifice to preserve and protect.